In terms of political organization, this is probably where we're going to spend a lot of time talking today, which we usually have. And again, it's the socio-political organization of groups. To be honest, is my kind of fascination. So you're stuck with that entry. Anyway, in terms of one thing that we need to look at is that this area, the Northwest Coast, definitely had a permanent winter town. Um, so this town would have been organized in some interesting ways. This would be an example of like a longhouse ceremonial structure. People identified themselves by their town, right? This is similar to how we operate in California. Somebody asks where you're from. If you're from inside the state, usually you identify with your town. Towns had secular leaders or chiefs, okay? And then situational leaders would arise too with conflict, famine, those kinds of things. They would pick other leaders as well. Allied towns would then have a chief in charge of those towns together. They did have slaves. And war was based on revenge, where men were killed and women and children were basically taken back to the victor's town. And they did utilize plank houses, which is this is an example of very long houses built of cedar plank. Again, politically, we're going to talk about this a little bit more with the potlatch, but one thing that we can say is that, okay, we had a permanent town, right, which then creates sedentary life, which then usually means that we're going to organize ourselves in this kind of this hierarchy way where we're going to have chiefs or leaders. Again, it's almost like if you settle down, then you kind of start to divide labor a little bit more. And this tends to be kind of a universal, to be honest. There's not many places where we have permanent settlements and we still have egalitarian kind of ways of life. There are a few here and there. But again, this is definitely a change. And the big questions here is why would they have slaves? And why would they have war? Well, we can definitely tell that there is a power structure or situation within this group. And again, I'm going to talk more about kind of the political organization when we get into the potlatch as well. Social organization, they were divided into three classes: nobility, which equal to chiefs, commoners, and then slaves for the bottom level. Fascinating in terms of kinship. They broke in terms of how they passed down their family line. It was matrilineal, or through the wife in the north. In the central area, it was bilateral, so both sides. And then in the south, it was patrilineal. Clan was the most important grouping. They all had coat of arms, and basically they were created by supernatural beings. Each clan was. Each family member had a rank, and then family occupied a rank in a lineage, and then each lineage had a rank in the clan. And then actually a clan member may come to be kind of the chief of that town. Rank was hereditary or ascribed. However, it was maintained with proper potlatch. I'm going to talk about potlatch in a second. Marriage was arranged. And then sometimes, the interesting fact around this group, sometimes a man would marry into a family because they wanted to obtain the right to perform a song or dance, which was owned by his bride's father. So the bride's father may have owned these songs and dances. Now, again, when we get into this and we talk about Native American groups not owning private property, we are now in the mode of sedentary villages and ownership, right? Slaves are a form of ownership. And then in this group, you could even own dances and brides, dances and songs, right? You would be the owner of those things. And I feel like this is a little bit the way that we operate in terms of our copyright laws, right? You can cover a song, but you definitely can't claim that it was yours. So some interesting kind of aspects here. And again, we can see maybe why the hierarchy exists, but we need to connect that more to the material culture and why the economics are in place the way that they are, and this ranking system and how it's set up. Okay. The whole idea of rank and ascribed power tends to associate more with agriculture, right? So when we get the development of agriculture, we have more sedentary life around villages, horticulture. And again, these people were operating horticulture only with tobacco. But what we need to talk about is that there is a certain aspect to these groups in the Northwest Coast that basically mimic agriculture. Okay, in terms of the potlatch, this is probably one of the most intriguing outside of the totem poles in terms of the Northwest Coast and how they operated. An event, a chief or a leader of a town would validate their rank through a demonstration of their worth and status through feeding and entertaining and giving guests gifts and things like that. They would be this would basically maintain their high ranking status. So this would show the people of the town that they were deserving of the title of chief. Okay, and these potlatches would be held for childbirth, puberty rites, marriage, funeral, building in a new home. So this is basically their version of checks and balances, right? So let's say that you had a childbirth and you were the chief. If you don't throw a good party, you're going to be challenged. And that's where this next term comes in, which is rivalry potlatch. And this is used for social mobility, so you can rise up through the ranks depending on the type of party you throw. A lower status group can challenge a higher status group, and then the public basically determines the winner. This is again, I think that this would be more of an interesting kind of symbolic war or ritual war in a way to take power from a different group inside your own group. And it's through throwing a party, right? A huge feast. If you feed everybody well and you give everybody the gifts, then you're going to kind of maintain party or maintain the power. If you can't do that, then obviously the public is going to kind of turn against you, and it's not really going to work out. Okay. In terms of the economics, wood was major to them in terms of the resource they used. I mean, the cedar bark and the underbark were used to make skirts and clothing. Rope was made through the other plant life in the forest, baskets as well. Eggs for waterfowl were a key piece here. Harpooning and doing some whale kills were definitely part of this group as well. They were not the main part, but they were indeed a piece of it. And they talk about how the whales were pretty tame when they would come into the inlets, and they were just basically kind of easy to hunt then. Candlefish were a huge part of their kind of material culture here. Candlefish were a very oily fish, so they would basically harvest the oil from these candlefish, and the oil was used for a number of things, and we'll talk about that when we get to the material culture and technology, but it was used to light lamps, for heating, those kinds of things. So the candlefish oil was a huge part of their kind of everyday life as well. The coho and sockeye salmon were really the salmons that were kind of the key part of their subsistence. Salmon runs were similar to a agricultural harvest, so this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, where everyone worked to either fish, process the fish, smoke the fish, and store the fish. It was all at the same time. So what I mean by why did these people maybe have the status structure and the hierarchy that they did, this would kind of be, in a sense, environmental determinism, which is the environment and how you get your food is determining your political and social structure. But it is also a certain level of cultural materialism, which is the way that you get your energy is also going to determine your political structure, right? And those are kind of interconnected, the ecological anthropology. So again, if we have a salmon run and it lasts, a month, 2 months, those kinds of things, we are going to be acting as we're harvesting. And in that process, what we do is we divide up labor. Okay, and the easiest way to divide labor, right? When we're kids, we do this when we're trying to make teams. We divide up labor the easiest way possible, and sometimes it's not always the fairest. But the way that a lot of groups did this when they had a huge harvest to do would be, you know what? The women are going to do this kind of job, which is butchering the fish, kind of making the soups and breaking down the fish and processing them, and the men are going to do the hunting and the fishing part. That would be the easiest way to divide. Now, in that division, what we do is we create a structure of hierarchy, right? And what we're looking at is now who has the most value and power in that hierarchy. So once we do that, now also maybe this is their justification for slavery, right? That there's so much work to do during these salmon runs that slaves are required to do kind of help with the salmon run and the processing. And then after that, right, they find other work for them to do, like building houses and structures. Now remember, if you're on the move and you're kind of moving around as a hunter-gatherer band group, foraging, slaves don't make sense to you unless you just want to sit around and kind of just eat all the food and not do anything. That doesn't really work. So slaves, to at least to kind of this group of people and why they might justify them, is that they would help with this sedentary lifestyle, which is harvest and the creation of the building structure and all of these other things. If you're moving around, slaves don't really work. So the correlation between this hierarchy of status, right, which is slavery, commoners, and nobles, really only works with this sedentary life. If we are moving around, or the food, and there's no gender roles, right? So let's say that we even have a semi-permanent village where the acorn harvest is important, but then there's just so much food around us that we could literally walk down to the river and kind of fish when we want and do what we want. And we're not reliant on necessarily a certain time of year with like a salmon run. Then we could be kind of semi-permanent and still be egalitarian. We don't need to have this division of labor and hierarchy. So again, it's not a universal, but this is a key indicator of why these things are happening, right? Some groups may, again, like the Ohlone that we'll talk about in the future, are permanent. They pretty much stay in the same place, but the land is so giving and the weather is so neutral and mild, and they may have started to create taboos around this hierarchical structure so that people were still treated equally. Remember, in the first 5,500 years of the Northwest people occupying this area, it looks like we had egalitarian societies and we didn't have war. Okay? Now, why is that, right? Maybe it's because their populations were lower and they decided that they were just going to kind of move around and do this egalitarian lifestyle. Now, this is the process. The tough part is that hierarchy can be as simple as somebody coming up with an idea or a charismatic leader. And we've seen that in our own time and history. We see that charismatic leaders have a big impact on how we organize and operate. And this may have been the example of Northwest Coast, right? There could have been a group of people, and this may have been kind of a hypothetical of way that this hierarchy structure could have started. There could have been a group of people that ultimately starts to settle. And what they do is they figure out how to smoke fish. And it may have been through this material kind of technological process when they realize that they can smoke fish and then they can just store their protein source for the whole year. Then they think, well, what the heck? I could just build this plank house right here on the ocean and never actually move, right? Now, in that process, they probably didn't think, well, this might lead to chiefdoms and a hierarchy and slaves and some of these other things. They didn't think that, but they probably just thought this is a good idea because, well, now we don't need to move, right? And fascinating enough, right? Now that they don't need to move around and gather because they probably weren't smoking fish forever. They were probably just, yes, they were relying on the salmon runs when they ran, but they were probably fishing and eating more mammal proteins in the forest and gathering vegetables and foodstuffs from the forest itself prior. But once you move into this realm of sedentary lifestyle, it also lends itself to putting on fat and gaining weight. And again, this relates back to modes of reproduction. So when we stop being hunter-gatherers, we are now able to, at least females are now able to have more progesterone because they're able to put fat on at a year-round basis, which means that they can have more children. So then population growth happens at a fast rate once people start to become sedentary. So now we have a couple things. People are in one place. We're dividing up labor. We're now having